This city in the 1960s, and jail in this county, and the streets of this city, and always brings back memories when I'm here. But I guess most pertinent, I was in a mass movement for social justice, ending poverty, civil rights, and it came into confrontation with the powers that be in the state, and there was suddenly an escalation. Brother Carl Davidson called it, he issued the call from the SDS office from protest to resistance in 1967. And I was part of that generation, and we felt, I felt, that public opinion had slowed down, was insufficiently activated, not to say lacking in any urgency or militance, so that we had to lead in a vanguard way or a catalytic way and fight in the streets and fight the institutions. If necessary, go to jail, go underground, face very uncertain futures. This was in the late 1960s, and many people suffered through those years, struggled through those years, whether they were in the armed forces, whether they were in the campuses, whether they were in the African American community, Latino community, people of all kinds. And I had gone from a kind of a idealistic perspective to one of doomed martyrdom, doomed radicalism. And it was quite surprising to me. It was quite transformative. And I'm telling you this only because we all come from our early experiences. We don't want to repeat them necessarily, but we have to keep processing them because they determine how we see later events. I was quite shocked and surprised in going from feeling that any day I would begin my long-term residency in federal penitentiary to being freed on appeal and seeing my adversaries going to jail themselves or being indicted, and seeing the troops withdrawn from South Vietnam, a covert war being unleashed against Indochina anyway, people not pacified, but in fact the demonstrations escalated. You had the 1971 May Day, where 13,000 people were arrested for civil disobedience and put in a vast football stadium named for the murdered Robert Kennedy. And I found myself quite shocked also by being invited by Congressman Ron Dellums to teach a course on the history of the Vietnam conflict inside the House of Representatives while I was on appeal for violating the federal conspiracy laws. And probably the greatest surprise, the most indelible memory, is going around the country with Jane Fonda, Holly Near, some Vietnam vets, former prisoners, and going from city to city and having a lobbyist in Washington and pushing and seeing members of Congress courageously vote again and again and again to cut the funding for the war and fail and fail and fail. And we go through all these movements, discussions, you know, what's the right path forward? But in the end, as I look back on it, the differences among us were not as great as what held us together. And the flood tide of public opinion finally broke through all the walls, not by magic. It was by organizing persistence, militance, and patience. And suddenly, the public, who we thought were behind us, were right with us. And many people experienced this in their own families as suddenly their parents who had been pro-war were suddenly feeling terrible, and there was a lot of heartfelt conversation about, by dads who sent their sons off to Vietnam thinking that somehow that would toughen them up, and then they had to deal as a family with these consequences of the polarization of the time. And it didn't last long, but a Vietnam syndrome was formed in which people who had been divided came together. They repudiated the war as a mistake, and they felt no more Vietnams, no more land wars, no more policing the world, no more imperial presidency, and let's reconcile the generations and the sides, and reconcile America and Vietnam, and reconcile the vets and the anti-war groups. It was a great learning experience, and it is possible to be trapped in one's past. I understand that, and I worry about that all the time, but I just want to begin my comments by referencing my past in hopes that it resonates and makes you think about where you were or your parents were during those same years. And it also may help us reconcile with each other in terms of perspectives. You know, you can't really create a coalition unless you have the capacity to have like a mental coalition, inner coalition, ability to accommodate multiple views at once, to realize that you should fight for what you believe, but you might be wrong, and you might learn something from the next table and might be surprised. This experience with Iraq has been full of surprises, has it not? The biggest surprise, perhaps, is how marginalized we were after 9/11 and how we are in sync with the majority of Americans only 5 years later. It's not easy for people who are committed to be marginalized if necessary to suddenly find themselves in a majority. It creates an identity crisis. What may we have done wrong to bring this about? This must be the ultimate co-optation, because here we are. I think in the history of social movements, they do begin with handfuls of radicals at the margins. They proceed through the mainstream, and around the core demand, they sometimes, every 30 years, may come to a majority moment where suddenly, while the original activists may not be satisfied, the public is there for what the original agenda was. And we have to find ways not only to think as a coalition internally, but think as people committed to our own identity, our own marginality, if you will, who also have to think and act according to the objective situation that we now are linked with majority thinking on this issue.